Yeah, thank you for coming today. I thought I would use this opportunity to talk a little bit about the commission itself, the process, and my ideas behind the piece. Part of that process was with the aid of Fiona at the RIBA, who could give me a lot of historic background on Charles Holden, the architect of the Sudbury town station. But I thought I'd begin a bit with kind of the commission and the invitation. I'm very interested in public art, and especially transport, metros, railway lines, transport museums, as you all know, never disappoint. It's an incredible history. And but the invitation to do some art on the underground, I knew immediately that there would be certain issues around it. First of all, as a painter, you're really interested in natural light, and that's something that you don't have on most underground stations. And the other issue is the predominance of signage and advertising in this kind of pell-mell of the kind of orgy of different styles and images, and how can you produce something that will have a kind of autonomy and character when you're competing with all these other these things in the station. But the wonderful people at Art on the Underground, I told them that I was interested in working in a station that had a kind of historical, had an interesting design, historical design. Always it's interesting to respond and to work within a specific context. So I got a list of stations and did a little tour of all the different ones that were proposed. And I saw some of these Art Deco ones, and I immediately thought of one of my favourite TV shows, Poirot, and the amount of wonderful, like the way it's this kind of library of British Art Deco and modernist designs. So I thought, oh, maybe this one's been in Poirot. The one that I finally chose, Sudbury Town, isn't in Poirot, but it's got other charms. I went with a friend, and when we arrived, she immediately kind of sat down for a break in the waiting room, and I just knew right away, this is the place. And then I kind of had to work backwards and find out, who this guy was and why I'd seen all these wonderful stations. This is not a very good photo, I'm afraid, but this is a period image. And this is another wonderful period image. Fiona, do you want to tell us a bit about Charles Holden?
We'll stick with this for a moment. Yeah. So just to say a little bit about Charles Holden. So just to go back a little bit in terms of putting it into context. So people tend to think of him as a sort of lone man, but he wasn't. He was actually part of a practice, Adams Holden Pearson, and they actually specialised. He joined in the 1900s, actually, late 1900s, and he actually they specialised in hospitals. That's kind of where they started. And they did the Royal Infirmary in Bristol. That was one of their main hospital designs. However, Holden was obviously he was very interested in kind of the idea of English modernism. So modernism was starting to take hold, obviously influenced by what was happening in Europe. But he wanted something that was a little bit more gentle, that was a bit more not so radical, I suppose. And he kind of collectively, with a number of other architects and designers, they got involved in an association called the Design and Industries Association, DIA, and that's how he met Frank Pick. So they're all very like-minded, architects, designers, businessmen, industrialists, and so him and Pick got on very well. And Frank Pick then had become the managing director of London Transport, or London Underground as it was then, and it was then that he commissioned Charles Holden to get involved in some of the kind of upgrades that he wanted to do on the Underground. So previously, a lot of the stations were very cluttered. They had a lot of competing styles. A lot of you will be familiar with the sort of Leslie Green, the earlier stations. Nothing wrong with those stations, but they don't necessarily have a consistency, a sort of clear look about them. They're very they're competing in terms of their different styles and different colours and so on. And you also had a lot of advertising. It's interesting you mentioned about advertising. There's lots of advertising going on. And again, you know, when you saw the station and you kind of entered, wasn't clear how you necessarily entered, and it was difficult for people to negotiate. So Frank Pick wanted to kind of clear all that away, and he wanted to start fresh. So they started with some stations that go from down to Morden on the Northern Line, and they actually built those with Portland stone. And Charles Holden came up with like a sort of kit of parts where he created like a screen, a folding screen effect, so it could be adapted according to what the site was like, the station site. So, for example, with Morden, which is on a sort of straight road, it was a 3-part screen, but it was completely flat. Whereas somewhere like Tooting Bec, which was called Trinity Road at that point, that was on a corner, so they could do the sort of wraparound effect with the folding screen. So that was a bit of a precursor. Holden also was commissioned to redesign the Piccadilly Circus station, which was this sort of cavernous space, and he completely, you know, redesigned that, opening it right up. And then just before he was commissioned to do the stations on the Piccadilly line extensions, going north and west, going out to Uxbridge, himself, Pick, Stanley Hoops, who was the head of the architecture department for the Underground, they went on a tour of Europe, of Northern Europe, and took in Stockholm, and they took in Denmark and various other places. And you can see this influence in some of Holden's stations for the Piccadilly line, in particular Eric Aspeland's design for Stockholm main library, with the cylindrical kind of elevated kind of main hallway. You can see that very much obviously in designs such as Arnos Grove up in North London. But then they came back from this tour, and that's when the commissions for the Underground started. And so Pick wanted Holden to redesign the stations going out to the suburbs, and to have a consistent sort of style, and to make them a lot clearer, and to have them much more open. And one of the, in fact, we'll stick with this. In fact, can we go back to that's it. So this is actually, Sudbury Town is very significant because it's actually the first station that he designed for the Piccadilly line extensions, and it's actually regarded as his sort of experimental station, where he was trying out all these new ideas. And I think the main thing that comes across with these stations is that it's a simple model, a kit of parts, so to speak, that he then would replicate throughout, which gives it this kind of consistency. But it would just be adapted slightly depending on the site. So he very modestly called this station a brick box with a concrete lid. But that's essentially what you're seeing here. But sometimes that would be adapted. So, for example, with Arnos Grove up in North London, it became a drum. The same with Southgate as well, although Southgate is like that spaceship-looking station, which is incredible, which is slightly lower. But you know, all these stations, the same with the station here at Acton Town, it's the same kind of consistent look. The use of brick, use of English brick, which is a sort of traditional medium, a lot cheaper to use. The previous stations going down to Morden, which have been used, they've been using Portland stone, which were, you know, beautiful to look at, beautiful white rendered finish, but Portland stone was expensive. So this is why, you know, to roll out a whole set of stations, he needed to use something that was going to be, you know, affordable. The other very distinctive thing about Sudbury Town and many of the other stations is these large windows, which at night, you know, with the light shining through, they would act as a kind of a beacon to the passengers, so they would be able to see the station from a long way away. And sadly, I mean, this station used to have neon lights. So they actually, the sign itself was in neon, and there are some early shots of that that got taken away, probably for maintenance reasons, I would imagine. But you know, the idea was that you would be able to see the underground from a long way away. So you haven't just got the signage, but you have got this sort of beacon with the lights. So if you want to, so this is a historical shot. So the other thing, another kind of aspect of these stations is this sort of the sense of the extension of the horizontal and the cantilever. So there's lots of use of cantilever, concrete roofs, and this kind of layered effect that you would get. So you get that at the actual station level, but in fact also going up from the platform level, going up to the entrance hall, you've got this sort of stepped effect with, again, these kind of blocks, and it's this kind of consistent approach. It's almost like a mini version of the main entrance hall, and lots of windows, so this idea of bringing in lots of light as well. So this is from the inside. As Lucy says, when we go down there, it's pretty much stayed as it is. It was regarded as one of his most important stations because it was the first of the Piccadilly line extension stations, and it has got so many original features. So it was in fact given grade 2 star listing some years ago. In fact, most of the Holden stations are listed in some form, whether it be grade 2 or grade 2 star. So again, that must have made it quite hard for you in terms of doing the work, because you know it's protected, the interior is protected. So,
but that's just part of public art. There's
yeah.
so many restrictions on what you can do conceptually or physically,
Yeah.
so that's just part of it.
yeah, yeah.
The thing that really caught my imagination in looking through this historic material, talking to Fiona and reading, was that there was no art commissioned for this station. There was, I mean, it wasn't every station, but from time to time there would be artwork.
Yeah.
I even read in some cases art that was repurposed from things like Empire exhibitions and great exhibitions. They'd be kind of put in stations. But when Holden under Pick was doing this series, they, partly for budgetary reasons, but also conceptually, they just said, well, advertising is so good. At the moment, advertising will be the decoration of the station. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because it's true. I mean, advertising, poster design was so wonderful at that time. And also what really caught my imagination was that Pick and Holden's designs were a really big influence on the Moscow metro. And I think Pick was even given a medal by Stalin.
Yes.
They loved Piccadilly. This is Holden Station, Gant's Hill, which is way out east, and it looks just like straight out of a spy film. As part of the research, I came to the depot here and looked through the poster archive, and it's true, just the history of the poster design here is incredible. There's some of the advertising out on the station at Sudbury Town. So when I saw the station, all these things came together that I could do some, instead of competing with the advertising in the station, I thought, well, maybe I could take over the advertising. So that instigated a discussion with TfL about, like, well, what can you do that? What does it cost? And that meant that a station a bit further out would be a lot cheaper than in central London. And I noticed actually that quite a few of the adverts at Sudbury Town were for TfL themselves. So obviously that was space that was available.
Yeah. Mm.
And then, yeah, as I said, as a painter, you're dealing with the elements. It's instead of in this kind of artificial light in a tube, you're competing with nature. There's plants, there's the changing seasons, and the other advertising around. The thing with advertising, of course, is always this idea of the sort of mixed messages. You don't know what your work's going to be next to, an advert for diet pills or in car insurance, or you just don't know. One of the poster artists that I looked at was a woman called Harry Perry, and there's some of the advertising in the station. Harry Perry did some really wonderful maps. Maybe we'll see them a bit later. Yeah, this is some more shots of Sudbury town, these incredible lamps, which are
Yeah.
sadly gone. But
That's something I'll just go on to say that another big part of Holden's work was that he was very keen to get this sort of integrated approach to all aspects of the design, not just the architecture. So, you know, you'll particularly see it at Sudbury Town, where you've got, you know, the lighting, all the kind of door handles, the handrails. They've all been considered, you know, they've all been designed. And you've, like you say, you've got still got the original little kiosk there. You know, it's all been carefully thought through, and there is a consistency. And the lighting, the full height lamp lights that they've got on the platform, I mean, there's not many of those around. They did have them going right the way through, right to Uxbridge, I believe, but obviously not all of them are still around, but they do have them at Sudbury Town, which is fantastic, and they're working as well, and they're beautiful, they really are. So it's this kind of consistent approach that Holden felt was very important, because it's all about branding, really. That's what it came down to. Pick felt it was really important for the public to understand this, that you are in a London Underground building, and they're providing that service, and so there needed to be that consistency, and it would be clear to passengers where they were and what was expected. So the same with the signage as well, you know, that there was a consistency with the signage, whereas before it was a little bit of a kind of mishmash of fonts and styles and so on. So,
which I guess is something we take a bit for granted today, because it was like what ushered that in.
Exactly.
But also seeing the space, it also just looked a bit like an art gallery. It just had that, it had the height and the light. So I started to kind of think, what could I do? What could I do as an artist? I wanted to do something that was meaningful, but wouldn't kind of, in a way, mask the station, or wouldn't compete with the beauty of the station as it stood. So I knew I wanted to do something that was kind of stylistically in tune with this period that it was made, and to really think about the way people interact with it. You know, people aren't going to come and see it like an art gallery. They're going to be kind of waiting or rushing, and you can't have those kind of expectations. So yeah, it's going to be in the corner of someone's eye. Here's some more of these incredible posters. I've got some images later on of works that I've made with maps before, and I think maps are always interesting because they're never neutral. They go out of date much faster than you would think, and they always tell a story. And so I started to kind of look through the maps, especially of the period, and I thought that I could do something with maps so that when people are in the station, they could kind of be aware where they are, because you're on the tube, you're not necessarily knowing exactly where you are in the city. Yeah, this is Harry Perry, and I like her maps because she puts in a lot of really kind of unnecessary detail and personal things, like, oh yeah, there's a really good pub here, or the view's brilliant from over here. But of course, looking at these maps, so I had like maps from the 30s, from the time, and then I had, maps today, which is like Google Maps. And of course, like, they're both very biased. These maps were full of things like cricket grounds and public schools and churches and golf clubs, and then Google Maps as well, all about Google Maps. So I had to kind of work out, okay, who's this map for, and how am I going to gather information to add to it? So through TFL, we contacted the local historical society and residents association, and they gave some good details about things like the Smith's Crisp factory that used to be here, and dance halls and dairies, and lots of local history. This is a work I made a few years ago, which combined two different maps of my hometown of Glasgow. One of the maps is a tram map dating from the time of the Empire exhibition in '37, when some new beautiful trams were commissioned for the city. And then overlaid over it is a more kind of psychogeographical map, which is for razor gangs in Glasgow in the 1960s, with all the great names like Tongs and Uncle and Bundy Boys, and so it's like two different maps put together. This was a map I made, I think it came from a Hungarian map, and there you can see, for instance, that the Iron Curtain is marked And because it was a Hungarian map, like Budapest was the biggest name on the map. So when I made this map, you know, wasn't clear that it was Hungarian, but the biggest shell on there was Hungary. It was for Budapest. So yeah, all these like little details you can put into a map. There's another one. And just train stations, just the history of the decoration as democratic spaces, as public spaces, places where you come and meet. For me, they really symbolise a kind of utopian and positive idea of the connectivity of railways. And yeah, of course, it's a very different time now. And yeah, the idea that you would meet your friends in the train station to get a coffee and a newspaper, and I don't know what they would be now, but of course, when I was thinking of the commission, I was like, can I do something that makes people live? Like, do you even need advertising in train stations anymore? Because the social space, the advertising space is in your phone. Are people even aware? So maybe with everything in the phone, public space can become kind of drained of all this advertising. One thing that's incredible on the Moscow Metro is just no advertising, and it makes for such a different experience. So I decided on making a map on the waiting room ceilings. So you wouldn't see them unless you were sitting waiting for a train. It was executed by a team of painters. I didn't want to do it myself. Painting on the ceiling is really, really hard work. You can imagine the blood draining out of your arm. So it takes like twice as long. But I had to prepare kind of really clear and legible directions for the painters, but they did a wonderful job. And here you see one of the final maps painted on the ceiling. Also transferring a map, you know, to take it from the to look at it like that and then put it on the ceiling, it's also messes with your head, because like it changes direction. It's all these things I had to figure out along the way. So yeah, we've got some of the local.
I think someone must have laid on the floor to take that, because
yeah.
yeah. So what's lovely is the lights that actually were there before, the ceiling lights, incorporating those, and that reflects the lighting on the platform, doesn't it?
And the edge of the map is the demarcation of the neighbourhood of Brent, which is the area where the station is based. And then another element of the work was these rented billboards on the station platform. As I mentioned before, I love the idea that the paintings would interact with nature over the time that they were in place. I think we worked out with our budget that we could we could rent them for a year, and they're still up. Of course, they went up the moment that the lockdown happened, so you know, there's nothing you can do about that. But so yeah, I just was thinking about the language of advertising, and I wanted to do something that was in the spirit of advertising from that time. But I had to work within the restrictions of what is allowed on the metro, because you're not allowed to, for instance, show smoking. And that was such a staple of advertising from the 1930s. It's one of the most kind of beautiful and seductive, and it was just like such a sight for fantastic graphic design. So we rented the billboards on the platform, but also these like little sandwich boards at the cafe inside. It was also important to me that the billboard in the design, it also incorporated part of the landscape, so that it was clear that it was made really specifically for that spot. The station's quite far out, and I really like the idea that, you know, how often does a suburban station get the love and care of an artwork made for it? It's what made the advertising cheaper to buy. But I really wanted to show that this was made for that station and for those people that use it. And so yeah, it had to be clear that it was for exactly that spot. Here you see those wonderful lamps that Fiona mentioned. And I wanted people to come to the station and kind of go, you know, on either side of it and really get a sense of the beauty of the station as a whole, so that it was to kind of pull people over to the other platform and to kind of walk around it and not just be this kind of point from A to B. here's some examples of the kind of advertising I was looking at in my research. So yeah, you can't have smoking. So I then decided on an image that was more like a kind of lipstick, but it looks kind of like a cigarette, because always the impulses of an artist is to kind of see how far you can go.
You can deny it as much as you like, but we can tell what it is.
Yeah, of course. Can't tell a lie. I don't know if any of you saw the wonderful exhibition of poster designed by women poster girls that was at the Transport Museum a few years ago. It was really fantastic. This is some of my previous work. This was 3 paintings I made to imagine as advertising for this like menstrual cup. It's called a moon cup, which always had really kind of eco packaging. It was always very soft and organic, so I wanted to make instead a poster for it that was really kind of punchy and pop. So yeah, that was some previous work of mine. And then this was inspired by a Hungarian graphic design I saw, and I translated the Hungarian and it said, everyone's cognac. And I realized that that must mean like everyone's cup of tea. In Hungarian, or they say in German, they say everyone's beer, or like not my beer. But in Britain, we say not my cup of tea. And it was a post, and I wanted to have a poster of like, so it's not for booze, it's for a book, it's for a paperback. But in a way, this is what diversity would have looked like in the 1930s. You've got people from kind of across the class divide. You've got like a servant and a secretary and a soldier. So it was kind of like what was considered back then, like inclusivity. And yet, again, this kind of cognac. People think, well, is this an advert for cognac? If it's for cognac, why are they reading books? So I wanted it to be ambiguous, because it's not advertising. It can say whatever it needs to. And then the final element was to make a scale model of the station that could, once the billboards were no longer in place, it could show that they were there, and to encourage people that see the station to think of the station as a whole. So from all the plans that I could get from here, we made a digital model, and then we made a cardboard model, and this was a model of the station with the model of the station in the model, which I still have in a box somewhere. And then it was finally, and inspired by the incredible scale models that you can see here at the station. I don't know if you've seen them, but some of them are they're quite sinister, because you realise that you're just in a tube, deep underground. It's they make me feel claustrophobic just looking at them.
There's a famous one here, I think, called the stomach model, which is for Piccadilly Circus, and it's kind of showing all the kind of interconnecting tubes at that station, and it's kind of nicknamed the stomach model.
Nice. So yeah, I worked with a crafts. I live in Brussels, and I worked with a crafts person in Brussels to make the scale model. And it's actually, from making a digital model and then turning it into like a doll's house. That was more. I didn't realize how complicated that would be, because you have to think of everything as like pieces of wood and knowing exactly how thick they'll be. So that was another thing I learned along the way. And so there was miniature versions of the artworks were painted.
Beautiful.
Here's inside the waiting room. And then he's with the little mini street lamps down at the craft shop.
They must have been so difficult to attach.
Keep
them straight.
What we did is the guy who made them did like doweling inside.
Okay.
No, the main pressure point was just like kind of gluing them together. Yeah, it was a lot of rushing at the end for then an artwork that didn't open for a year, but no, in the end we're very happy. Yeah, that's the mini version of those.
That plinth is beautiful. I just noticed it's on a slope.
What do you mean?
It looks like it's angled, or is it just
that's just the picture, yeah.
Okay. I didn't think it was, but yeah. I mean, it's the attention to with the plinth. It works with it's respecting the other bits of architecture. Interior architecture with the ticket kiosk close by.
Yeah, that felt really important. As a kind of love letter to Holden and a love letter to the station, it had to be as consistent as possible. That's it at night.
It looks like it's not lit, is it? It's just the way the light's coming through from the upper windows.
No, it's not lit.
No.
Okay, that's it.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Is there anything else I can add?
So actually just ask you a question about the model.
Yeah.
So this is the first architectural model that you've made? Or have you done any before?
I mean, I had 5 dolls' houses
Okay.
as a child. I was a dolls' house addict. My favourite thing was to take everything out of the doll's house and redesign the interior and redo the artworks and then fill it again and then take everything out.
Okay.
And so I'm...
But you didn't make those from scratch yourself?
No, and I
No.
didn't make this, but I worked with
Yeah.
a craftsperson.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then we decided to like open up the roofs of the waiting room so that you could see it.
I think the thing about architectural models is it's obviously everything has to be at scale. I think you said this is 1 to 20.
1 to 20, yeah.
But it's also getting the medium, the material has to also be to scale, and that's where it can sometimes go wrong. So when you came to visit the archives, the RBA Drawings and Archives, you saw the model that we have of one of the stations.
Yeah.
They're
very small, actually.
They are. They're
yeah.
much. Yeah, I think they're 1 to 100 actually. They're
Yeah.
really, really small. But it's that attention to detail. I mean, those models have even got little posters, sort of right for the period, sort of outside. But I think this is really beautiful, and it's a great record of, like you say, of what you've done, the installation. So this will continue to live on, even when the poster artwork is potentially gone, and if the ceiling gets painted over, which would be very sad if it does. But let's just hope it can remain on site as well.
Yeah.
But it's good because it's not something that has to really be maintained, because that's another thing you have to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at first I of course wanted to illuminate all the little lamps, but then that's about running cables and no.
Anything like that is definitely going to be a problem further down the line. So it's a beautiful model, really.
Yeah, and just to remind people of the beauty of the building.
Yeah.
To remind them that, and it's you also met, because we went to the station yesterday together, and we were looking at the planting on the platforms, and you mentioned that because it's part of this expansion and it's almost like a bit of a garden city around
so
here.
So certainly, so back in the sort of 30s and 40s, when these stations were being built, planting was, it was seen as very much a sort of the extension of the sort of garden suburb and these garden villages like you had down at Harrow, and so planting actually became part of a sort of integral part of all these raised beds and so on, part of the outside spaces next to the platforms. And there was a bit of rivalry sometimes that went on between the stations, in terms of competing who had the best sort of station garden. And I think there's been an element of that's been revived a little bit. I certainly have noticed that when I used to live out towards in Harrow. There was some of the stations certainly took that on, and a bit of pride in the building, in the station itself.
Yeah, well, this station here also has like a community bookshop inside it, and a little cafe, and so it's because it's in quite a kind of suburban area. There's not much near there, so it also feels like a really important place if you live around there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So just can I ask, how long did it take you? How long did the actual installation time take?
The painting of the murals took maybe about 6 weeks, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the model took about the same time, and the billboard. I mean, the great thing with Art on the Underground is that as an artist, you just kind of come up with the ideas, and then they go off and find people to make plinths and to find to do the painting. So that takes a lot of the weight off your shoulders. Because I was at the beginning, I was thinking like, can you put canvas out? Could I do a painting and put it outside? And of course you can't. It's like it would be destroyed. So then finding, the right people to print it, and so all of that is a lot of back and forth, and then the signage. So like if you're an artist, you're used to just being in your studio and kind of doing whatever the hell you want. And then I don't know if some artists feel a bit frustrated by the fact that you are quite restricted by budget, and you know, you can't have, there's certain things you just can't have in a public artwork that's kind of offensive, or so you're constantly having to kind of shape your ideas towards the restrictions you're presented with. But in this case, it just didn't even really, all of them just put it in a direction that felt even more meaningful, because I didn't feel like my ambitions were thwarted by all the kind of rules and restrictions.
There wasn't a kind of list that they gave you beforehand saying you can't do this, you can't do that.
No.
It was only through talking through what your ambitions were, what you wanted to do, that's when you came to realise, oh, actually that isn't going to work, or
So as far as the whole process, I can't even remember, but it's it felt like enough time for something that was going to be so permanent.
Yes.
You know, that's something not to do casually.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. Is there any questions?
Any questions from anyone? Yes.
Hello, could you tell us a bit more about the map and what you chose to put on and what you thought in terms, because you mentioned geography and you mentioned your past work. How did you pick what to put on this map, and what does it mean to you?
I wanted to have things that had, a cross between things that are around just now and things from the past, and things that just felt like the things that kind of came up if you looked over any kind of local history of Brent. So things like the Ace Cafe, it's like a biker bar. The Jubilee Clock, it's like a clock on a high street that seems to people love.
A local landmark, I suppose.
Yeah, the Galtymore Dance Hall. There's a bunker. Built like architecture of note, like the town hall, which is up there. And then I just had to kind of find like a process like a kind of typography to use for roads, and a typography for like rivers and then areas, and so just trying to think, well, it's going to be for the people who live here, so as much as possible reflect like places they know, but then also get local histories, like the Smith's Crisps factory. I don't know if we can see that here. Wembley Stadium, of course. Hospital. Yeah, I mean, I'm not too sure, just things that seemed important to people around here from all the feedback we got from the local residents.
Any other questions?
I had a question. Seeing those maps that you made, and also the examples you shared from Perry Perry.
Yeah.
It seems quite incongruous in a way that she had chosen to, within this very modernist poster design, to reflect these. It's almost a medieval style of like depicting the countryside.
That's the 30s, though.
Yes.
That was really
this
big
is an
then.
arts and crafts moment, which seems in common.
Look at there's a part of the 30s that was very shields and empire, and it was a kind of interesting moment.
But that's also something that you picked out and explored in the way you looked at the landscape.
The landscape.
Yeah, in the map that you created.
It was more just being aware of thinking when was this map made, and what was the people who made it, what would have been important to them, and just knowing that every map is not neutral, and that the information that is put on there is put by people who
and this is a great example, isn't it, it's sort of history telling, isn't it?
Yeah,
but
and
it's
a construction
also,
of British history.
And local, so it's a sort of slightly, sort of educating people. It's got to feel sort of childlike quality. You can imagine this is how you would teach children local history somehow.
Yeah, and at this moment when London's expanding and there's all this idea of what's good for you, and people were going out on like the train to go
Yeah.
go walking, and so yeah, it's got this very kind
But
of.
you're right, it is very much a reflection of being proud of our British history and that kind of sense of this is who we are, this is our identity.
It's right at the end of the Empire project, so it had to become more like as the real power goes away, it gets more and more symbolically kind of reinforced.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you find in all these maps from the 30s.
Yeah.
Just looking back at your map, is there anybody that you consulted with regards to what you were going to put on the map in terms of local significance?
Yeah, the Brent Residents Association and the local historical group. I can't remember. Do you remember? Have you got you've got the name of them there, haven't you?
The Sudbury Town Residents Association.
Yes.
There's a museum in Brent, the Brent Museum.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.